What's up, everyone? Welcome to today's video. Welcome to the Video Game Fight School channel. Thank you very much for tuning in. Starfield is being dragged for having a number of loading screens. Now, I wanted to highlight this because I think this is a misnomer in the way people are categorizing it, like it's some kind of deficiency. You know what I mean? Like, well, it just has all these loading screens. And so, if it wasn't for that, everything's just going to be great. Now, I understand that, loading screens in quote, I'm going to put in quote, big quotes around it, can, break immersion. Usually people want a continuous streaming of their levels and continuous loading and unloading of games. But every game is designed very differently. Every engine, every team will execute their games in very specific ways. And I think what's going on is a lot of people are not necessarily dialed in as to the importance and good practice of actually using very solid loading mechanics to be able to execute your video game. And let me tell you why. So first of all, the console side of the console wars, the rage farming and the faux concerns that people put out there are a catalyst to driving this conversation. So it's already kind of weird and twisted if you were to ask me. People are like, oh, well, look at you playing Starfield. You're basically watching loading screens. That's already number one in regard to people being dishonest. In fact, I actually encountered one of them on the internet where they said, oh, Starfield has got loading screens. Yeah, that's all you're doing. It's a last gen game. The game is just so stupid. And I had to reply and say, loading in a game is essential. Stop with the nonsense. Every game loads levels, every single one. And they came back with all of these insults. This person's name is Cake. That's what their name is. At Soy El Eleco Loco is what they call themselves. So they asked me and said, have you played Ratchet and Clank? I said, I have. What about it? I mean, I was waiting for, this was already a trap. I was waiting to pretty much pin them because I wanted them to see the ridiculousness of this particular line of thinking. Now, not saying everybody who's, pointing out the loading screens in Starfield has invalid claims. I'm just saying that there are some that are pointing it out in bad faith and some who have actually adopted that and said, maybe it is a bad thing. But here's how this went. This person said, are there loading screens? I said, I don't remember saying anything about loading screens. And I posted my comment, say loading in a game is essential. Stop with the nonsense. Every game loads levels, every single one. And then they talked about loading screens. And I was like, a loading screen or a sequence is basically accomplishing the same thing. They're loading levels or sub levels. Their loading sequences could be blank screen or hitting in plain sight. But every game has some mechanic to accomplish it. And he kept asking, where are the loading screens in Ratchet and Clank? Just shut up. It's easier for you to do that. And I said, just because you don't know doesn't mean there aren't. And it's all right where it's right there where you're falling through the rift. That's literally where your loading screen is in some cases. And he says, where are the loading screens? And I said, okay. And then he mentioned this. He said, it's using the SSD, and Bethesda did not bother to just allow for seamless loading of Starfield because they, either they didn't want to or they just couldn't do it. It's a last gen game. And I laughed and said, so you mean to tell me Spider-Man Remastered and Spider-Man Miles Morales are last gen games? And I said, say it ain't so. This is what happens when a lot of people are just out here to spread misinformation. And this is what I got to do. I got to come back and do the cleanup. So believe it or not, there was a video up here online that actually did show how Ratchet and Clank's loading was actually very fast. Now, it's not necessarily like your traditional loading screen, but when you take off in your ship, I think this is Rift, there is a loading screen. And this is it right here. It plays an animation where you have no control over the game at all. So this is pretty much your loading. You can't control the player. And the reason we actually know that is because a developer here who actually challenged the notion of the SSD, this was a long time ago, actually. This is before the PC version, came out, actually claimed and said you can actually run Ratchet and Clank on your PS4 because there were ways to be able to load the levels that were very, very interesting that game developers use all the time. So he mentioned and said, if you wanted to do it, what you could just do is you could just basically be loading stuff as you're moving from one place to the other. So this is the way the Rift and the Pocket Dimension works. If you want to walk into a Rift in an area, what's happening is as you're moving towards that Rift, the level is basically loading. And game developers can actually do that. There are what we call all kinds of collision and trigger boxes that you can use to do stuff like that. If you are well versed or maybe even not really versed in game development, if you step over something, you can create something where if a player steps over it, if they walk close to it, it will trigger something else. It will highlight, say, a cutscene, or it will pop up a menu or pop up an option to say pick it up or whatnot. You can create something like that in front of a rift where if somebody walks into it, you can then trigger that rift to load. So this is one way of executing something like that, and then he also went and mentioned and said, he did a project like that, and he said if you wanted to actually do something like that in Ratchet and Clank, you could just use a memory buffer. You don't really necessarily have to be beholden to the SSD. And so while the person is approaching the rift, you're starting to load the other area in regard to that, rift. And then, I hope you guys are seeing this. And then by the time they actually get through that rift, the other side of the, level is already loaded as well. And so this is something you can use memory buffers for, because already you're loading it, and then boom, as the character is falling through, you also do that. This developer actually made this in a Star Wars game from back in the day. And what you could do in this particular case was you could play the game, this section of the game, in 2 different levels. So you could swap to, Obi-Wan and, it being a gunship, or you could go to the other side and be the 2 Jedi running around and basically beating people up. And that was a much more complex, development paradigm to pull off in a video game compared to what Ratchet and Clank did. And so this whole loading screen thing, ladies and gentlemen, is, in my opinion, a very, very silly notion, because this person said, I'm sorry, but you can't defend Starfield's loading screen. It's pretty bad. No, it's not. It's literally half a second window anywhere from me. Nothing to complain about if you have good memory. And this one says it's 20 to 40 seconds for me on the Series X. Having to fast travel every 5 minutes gets annoying. Well, you don't understand why your loading screen is actually there. And something then went ahead and happened. This El Soy Loco person went ahead and said to me and said, after they finally, I pinned them to the wall with this Marvel Spider-Man, remastered comment. And I said, okay, if a loading screen is actually bad, then you have to also say that Marvel Spider-Man 2 is a last-gen game, remastered, sorry, not Marvel Spider-Man 2, but Marvel Spider-Man Remastered is a last-gen game. And then they said, so you know how game development works? I really hope you're faking this stupidity. So this is where they actually pinned themselves. And I said, I actually do, homie. 3 years, going on 4, learning on Unreal Engine 4 and Unreal Engine 5. And then I basically explained and said, you actually need to be able to load aspects of your game because you maintain the fidelity of your save state, your player progression, and all the stuff that your player has accomplished in relation to the game's progress. Especially a game like Starfield, where you have a lot of physics assets, like these people that are on the internet basically loading 1,000 potatoes into their, ship's hatch. When you actually decide that, these particular items, you're going to be picking them up and, walking around with your player. When you decide to go somewhere, the way they've decided to design the game is they want to account for all those different physics assets. So when you make your way to a new planet, or when you make your way to an old planet, the way you met that old planet and the other things that were there and how you interacted with them is stored in memory. And so that has to be loaded in. Every developer would have pulled it off differently. Not saying that the Starfield loading screens are the only way, but it is the way that they've decided to do it to make sure that you maintain your progress and also give you multiple save capabilities so that you can also load quickly. I had a bug on when I was playing Starfield on one of my computers. I noticed that this computer will crash a lot, and I've noticed that it's usually a little low-end hardware that's been crashing with Starfield. The game is insane. The only place I don't have any issues is when I'm playing on my 4090. But when I'm playing on my 1080 Ti, oh my gosh, the game would just stop. It would just quietly crash. It's the weirdest thing ever. But I've heard people say, oh, it's a Bethesda game. So I'm like, okay, so this is what it means to be a Bethesda game, whatever. And I had a bug where when I use the scope and a weapon, it will basically knock my player character's head off. It was the weirdest thing ever. And I thought, no freaking way. This is a bug in a weird sense. But because I had the load and the save functionality that basically saved the game state, I could just go back and load that same file, and it wasn't really a big deal. So again, this is something where I go ahead and say, look how somebody else basically adopted this local in my opinion, paradigm thinking that, a loading screen is such a bad thing, even to the point where I actually pinned this person to the wall where they went ahead and said that Spider-Man Remastered is basically a DLC. I was like, what did you just say? This person basically is playing with fire because I had to basically stop them and say, this is what they said. They said, that Spider-Man and Miles Morales are PS4 games available on PS4. The remaster is just a bundle with the DLC. That is not true. The remaster was a game that was rebuilt using a new voice and face character actor model with new features added to it, including the PC version, which was made afterwards. So why would Insomniac, one of the best development studios in the world, employ loading screens that, in my opinion, are actually significant whenever you look at it? Why would they do that? It's because that is good game design methodology. The way you feel about a video game, you ought to tell yourself and ask yourself good questions and say, am I being, in my opinion, am I being consistent with how I see these different paradigms or how I see these mechanics employed in video games that may be a little challenging to kind of, put my head around? And if a game like Spider-Man would be loading in the way it's designed, how about a game like Starfield, or how much more a game like Starfield, where Starfield has way more assets, way more physics interactions than Spider-Man, like thousands more if you actually were to make a good comparison, and how much more a game like that. So I'm not saying that it's the best system out there. The developers executed the game in the best way that they thought would help the player. But for people to come out here and start to make that argument, in my opinion, is one where they're just not versed in what it is they're saying. Because other games that I'm sure have been enjoyed by them also had loading screens. But now you're playing a game that is at a bigger scale. So now you're seeing more loading screens. And so you just say, oh, well, this is a problem. When in reality, it's like, okay, why are loading screens even in a game in the first place? Why are they loading sequences? They're there to be able to preserve the fidelity of your progress. They're there to be able to make sure that you don't go have a game-breaking bug that, you can't get around, because these game-breaking bugs usually show up in many, many video games for the most part. But in a game like this, because you have multiple saves, the game is constantly keeping track of your activity. You have exit saves and so on and so forth. It's going to be there to allow for you to be able to keep account of all kinds of stuff, your progression, your physics assets, the world and the world state, because the worlds are procedurally generated. So when you walk into a new world, that world is generated. If you knock something down, you pick up something and drop it over here, well, now that's actually going to be saved in memory. Something's got to load all of that. That's just not going to be, that just doesn't, come for free. It is a labor that has to happen over the course of, your progression of the game. But anyways, I thought I'd go ahead and talk about this and mention this. And, I know there are other games that don't necessarily use a lot of, loading and saving. But, I've seen many people think that they don't. But what they're doing is they're doing a lot in real time. That's a whole different conversation for, another video. But thanks so much for watching this one. I appreciate y'all. And hopefully we'll talk pretty soon in another one. Peace out.